Welcome to Voices of the Community, which explores critical issues facing Northern California communities. We introduce you to the voices of community thought leaders and change makers who are working on solutions that face our fellow individual community members, neighborhoods, cities, and our region. This is George Koster, your host. This episode is part of our series exploring COVID-19's impact on nonprofits and small businesses in the San Francisco Bay Area. Back in April of 2020, when we decided to create this ongoing series on COVID-19's impact, first on nonprofits and then on small businesses in the San Francisco Bay Area, we, like you, had no idea how long the pandemic would go on and what the health and economic impact would be in our community. Even with vaccinations slowly increasing for adults, new vaccinations for children, and boosters for adults, as we go into the fall and winter of 2021, we're seeing a potential fourth wave of COVID-19 with cases and deaths increasing. This all adds to the ongoing uncertainty of our ever-changing indoor and outdoor, vaccinated and unvaccinated protocols, and the politics of the pandemic that will drive how we all come back together as a unified or fractured community. We will continue to shine a spotlight on the nonprofits and small businesses that make up the fabric of our community, along with the founders and staff who are struggling to deal with the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on their operations, services, and sustainability until we can all get to the other side of the pandemic. Along the way, we will also share with you all the amazing solutions that our nonprofits, small businesses, foundations, and government leaders are working on to help us all get to the other side of the pandemic and come together to rebuild our communities with more economic, social, and environmental equality.
To make sure that our most isolated members, especially our elders, many of whom have survived a pandemic before and the HIV/AIDS crisis in their lives, could have community contact, had folks who would drop off groceries, who would help them move in the middle of the pandemic. We started a mutual aid project to make sure that folks had food and basic resources. And over the last year, one of our committees has trained over 150 trans and queer API people on the basic and essential skill of how to ask for help and how to identify your needs. Because we know that the story of white supremacy and transphobia tells us every day it is not okay to have needs and there will be no one there to support you. And we know that is not true.
This is the co-director of APINC, Yuen Wang. This episode is focused on sharing the work of two grassroots organizations, Blue Heart, which empowers individual funders through their efforts of identifying and funding under-resourced organizations, such as APINC, who works with our Asian American and Pacific Islander, trans, queer, and working class, Black, Indigenous, and community of color community members. I'm joined remotely by the co-founder and director of Blue Heart, Lindley Meese, and co-director of APINC, Yuen Wang. Welcome to Voices of the Community, Lindley and Yuen. Let's start out with having both of you provide some background information on each of your organizations to the audience. And I'm going to turn to Lindley first and have you provide an overview of what is Blue Heart and all of your programs and your relationship to APINC.
Awesome. Thank you, George. And thank you so much for having us on this show. So hello, everyone. My name is Lindley, and Blue Heart funds grassroots organizations that are building the political power of low-income communities and communities of color. We work primarily in the Bay Area, but we also work across the country funding grassroots orgs, making change in their communities who are dramatically under-resourced and often overlooked by traditional philanthropy, but are doing the radical work on the ground to build the resilience and self-determination of communities. And in turn, we help develop and inspire an ethic of giving among young folk, kind of young professionals seeking to engage in social and environmental issues local to the places that they live or across the country. So what that actually looks like is that every month we feature a different community-led grassroots organization like APINC, who you'll hear from in a moment. And we send our members stories from frontline leaders from those organizations, political education to understand the context and the history of those movements, sets of action opportunities to engage further. And then we also do other programming, like we host events, so that members can dig deeper around particular movements or leaders that are inspiring to round out their political education. We do an annual giving guide, which I'll talk about later because we're in that campaign right now. We put out communications and collaborate with other partner organizations around kind of like elevating the conversation about how do we move along in the journey of reparations in this country towards healing and repair. And we also have a creators fund. We really understand and believe that art and cultural organizing is central and the first part of political change. So we have a creators fund, which each of our members give to each month that our partner organizations can dip into and do art projects and collaborations that really inspire and animate their work in the world. And with that, I will pass it over to Yuan to give a flavor of what does this actually look like? What are some of the organizations that we support?
Amazing. Thanks so much, Lindley. My name is Yuan. I'm one of APINC's co-directors. At APINC, we're an organization of transgender, non-binary, and queer Asians and Islanders organizing for justice here in the Bay Area. Our movement generally follows three pillars in our theory of change. We focus on healing justice and providing support and care for our community. We focus on community safety and challenging the violent systems that cause us harm on the day-to-day. And we focus on building intersectional, values-led, and relationship-centered movements. And similar to that last point, a lot of our work happens through relationships, happens with our values of abundance and interdependence at the center, and happens through organizing our community here in the Bay.
Thank you. My next question is for both of you, and I'm going to start with you, Lindley. How has the pandemic impacted Blue Heart's ability to attract funds, for example? Has it fallen off? Have people gotten more engaged because they see the need?
Yeah, thanks, George. So in some ways, our programming hasn't changed a lot. And in some of that, what you're referring to at the end, like the deeper kind of ethic and impulses behind the work have been greatly amplified. So on a practical level, a lot of our programming has moved online, which has cost us the vibrancy of in-person relationship building, but has allowed us to expand our reach to folks outside the Bay and beyond our normal reach of folks. So that has been really excited to see our community expand in that way. I think more importantly, COVID-19 has brought into much starker relief the interlocking injustices of this political moment and how the root causes of the climate crisis and the pandemic are interconnected. And then in tandem, the racial justice uprisings of last summer have clearly demonstrated the power of social movements that are built over time from a really grounded base and from organizing on the ground, and has mobilized a really big portion of the liberal base to yearn for deeper connection to and desire to support grassroots organizing. So we've seen an increase in Blue Heart membership by 20% in the last year, and I think in large part because of those shifts. Finally, part of what Blue Heart has done and strives to do is build a bridge, both an empathy bridge and a bridge across the wealth gap between tech workers and Silicon Valley and grassroots organizations who are so negatively impacted by the footprint of that industry. And as tech wealth has skyrocketed during the pandemic, while many of the communities that are struggling with the basic necessities because of that extreme inequality has really, again, brought into relief the imperative to redistribute the accumulated wealth that has been occurring over the last year from the pandemic. So we're mired in how do we do that? How do we facilitate that actively in conversation with folks that are really reckoning with that question and taking action on it?
Thank you, Lindley. That was a really good overview. And I wouldn't have thought that the pandemic would be actually a really good upside to get people to focus. I think what the pandemic has provided is the proverbial x-ray of how broken the social safety net is. I want to circle back, Yuan, to you talking a little bit more about APINC's programs and services. I know you have a leadership development program with apprenticeships. Can you talk a little bit more about the organization's work to, if you will, incubate leaders within the trans API community?
Yeah, thanks for asking. And I think that question is really related to the COVID pandemic too, and the way that our community has responded in the past 2 years. For so many people who come to APINC, being in an APINC space, whether it's a potluck or a committee or the summer organizer program, one of the leadership development programs, it's so often the first time that they're with other trans and non-binary Asians and Pacific Islanders. For many folks, like for me, the first time I walked into the summer organizer program, it's the first time that we feel safe and we feel fully seen with other people who are like us. And at the start of last year, learning that we were going to need to shelter in place and wouldn't get to be together in person, wouldn't get to cook food to prepare for a committee meeting or look after each other in that way, it was deeply devastating. I heard from a lot of members who would just text me in early March and April saying, it's really painful that I can't come to the office or we can't go to the trans justice meeting together. But I think what's been really beautiful is the way that people have taken all the skills they have learned through years of caring for each other and built new programs during COVID to support each other. Last year, at the very start of the pandemic, a group of our members came together to build a phone tree to make sure that our most isolated members, especially our elders, many of whom have survived a pandemic before and the HIV/AIDS crisis in their lives, could have community contact, had folks who would drop off groceries, who would help them move in the middle of the pandemic. We started a mutual aid project to make sure that folks had food and basic resources. And over the last year, one of our committees has trained over 150 trans and queer API people on the basic and essential skill of how to ask for help and how to identify your needs. Because we know that the story of white supremacy and transphobia tells us every day it is not okay to have needs and there will be no one there to support you. And we know that is not true. And so aside from all those programs and bringing a lot of our stuff online, it's really been an opportunity for us to adapt. And I think even though it's been really challenging, and like Lindley said, we don't have those moments of just like organic friendship or, we log right off Zoom after a meeting instead of hanging out or walking each other and making sure we get to BART safely. I think people have still really dug into care for each other.
So staying with you, Ewan, we've had this, I call it the magical reopening. On June 15th, we're all supposed to come back. Then, of course, Delta hit and it all went backwards, et cetera. In the coming back from the pandemic, what are some of the things that you've noticed? People more cautious or people coming back together? So much about what you just described is all about family. It's all about community. It's all about trust. So do you feel like people are coming back out to a point where they feel comfortable and trust, and especially given all of the violence on our API community during this last 19 months as well, even in San Francisco on Market Street, especially with our elders?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, George. I think there are two big parts that you make me think of there. One is around our safety with COVID. And the second is just a bigger question of, are trans and queer API people going to be safe as we navigate the world? Have we been safe? I think to the first one, to be honest, we have learned so much in the past 2 years about how to practice disability justice and how to practice access intimacy. Folks have needed to be online for as long as online has been a thing for the past few decades, but it's only been a reality for so many more of us in the past 2 years. So I even notice as we start to do our first things in person or our first hybrid things with an in-person component, that people are so thoughtful about asking, what are your COVID needs? How can we make sure that the people who are most vulnerable, we're meeting those needs, whether it's being masked or getting tested or providing proof of vaccination? And I hope that this provides our communities a deep lesson in how to practice that kind of access care going long term. I think when it comes to our bigger picture of safety, though, that's been a question for us before the pandemic. You had asked Lindley earlier, I think, a great question of how has the pandemic affected our fundraising or our ability to get resources? And to be honest with you and everyone who's listening, the day after a group of women, Asian women workers, were killed in their place of work in Atlanta, I woke up and I get notifications when people donate to APINC on my phone. And I just had an unbelievable amount of emails notifying me of donations. And I think it'd be easy to think, wow, that must feel so exciting or good. But I actually just started sobbing, standing in my kitchen, just crying, because it made me so angry to think that it took people dying. It took murder for people to move their resources to something that they do believe in, to make our communities a priority. And so even though we've received an amount of attention and that is unprecedented for our broader Asian American Pacific Islander communities, I think the big question going forward is, what will we do to make sure that we are a priority beyond the time that we are a trend, and to make sure that's true of our funders, supporters, and our own people.
Thank you. And Lindley, what do you feel has been some of the most impact the Blue Heart team has had prior to the pandemic, and then in the pandemic, if you will, and now starting to come out of the pandemic?
Biggest impact, that's a hard question. First, I just want to acknowledge Yen sharing that story. That was really moving to hear, and really want to echo that, like the rage and the motivation to really like animate folks' engagement in their community, in this like global community, in this global moment, in a way that like they fully see their stake in the collective. And I see that happening and I feel excited by it. And also there's like these tragic moments. And I think the racial justice uprisings is another example of that, where is this really what it takes? Yeah. How do we really humanize ourselves and each other way before harm happens? So to your question, George, it's in our small, scrappy way, Blue Heart has helped people envision new possibilities for how to be in relationship to movements. We've supported members in seeing themselves as part of social change and loosening their hold on the individualism and greed and exceptionalism that bind us so tightly to the systems of supremacy that we live within. And I have had so many conversations with members that did not previously understand the power of collective action, the power of organizing. And now through just light touch with the work that we do as an all volunteer team, they feel connected to the levers of change and really can see the possibilities of a more just and beautiful world. So I think igniting that imagination through the small pieces of programming that we do is the small but meaningful footprint that we have. And one example of that is we used to, at the beginning of Blue Heart at our birth, we had a couple of years of working on a monthly basis with different local artists to collaborate with grassroots organizations to really bring alive their visions in artistic form. When we became an all volunteer team, we moved away from that model. We started the Creators Fund. And during the pandemic, we brought it back because we just heard so consistently from members that like tangible, like tactile connection through an art print, through hearing about the stories from the Creators Fund really was the piece for them that allowed them to hold on and understand what community meant, what grassroots change could look like and could lead to. So now we're doing more of those kind of collaborations coming out. And of course, hopefully more in-person events. I think we're going to always preference the online because of its greater accessibility, its greater reach. And folks in various localities up and down the West Coast have been clamoring for more in-person experiences so they can connect with other people asking similar questions about their role and their positionality and their participation in this moment.
And to stay with that for a moment, Lindy, is Blue Heart's vision or intention to also bring together someone like A-Pink and to bring A-Pink together in a community event with Blue Heart's funders community for an educational, informational exchange, community building exercise? So that if I'm a funder or a member of Blue Heart, I could see my money being directed into A-Pink and I get to put a proverbial face on what is A-Pink and who the members are, and they get a chance to talk to you and et cetera.
Yeah. So we've played with that in different ways over the years. And the first 2 years of Blue Hearts, we would do these quarterly events where our grassroots partners, if they wanted, come together with our members. And they were really powerful. There were tears, there was transformation. I've had people say that they were some of the most powerful events they've ever attended, because I think the most valuable and meaningful part of Blue Heart is that we have trust with grassroots organizations, and that trust enabled speaking truth to power in those spaces in ways that folks hadn't really heard before. We moved away from that model just because the kind of scale of our support isn't really large. We were like, we feel uncomfortable asking this of our partners, and we've brought it back in various ways. So there's been times when we've sent invitations that are like, are you excited to do this political education? If this excites you, we want to facilitate these connections because they're so impactful for our members. So I'll actually pass it to Yuan, because Yuan was involved alongside the Black Organizing Project in one of those events that we held earlier this year.
Yeah, that's true. I was there and it was so powerful. Thanks for sharing that, Lindley. As a little context, Blue Heart brought together A-Pink and folks from the Black Organizing Project, a really powerful organizing group here in Oakland, to talk to Blue Heart's funding partners and folks who are a part of that community. And in addition to everything that Lindley said, all that powerful impact, I think one of the biggest impacts for us is that powerful movement work does not happen in silos. It happens in ecosystems and in deep relationships. And at A-Pink, we have been deeply impacted by the Black Organizing Project's work. And it was just really special for us to be in conversation about that together. And I think so often what the funding world does is it asks you to present yourself or your organization as more deserving of funds than any other group or person working for this cause. And I think I can see the ways that Blue Heart is actively challenging that individualism in the world of philanthropy, in the world of funding. And I think it was a really beautiful moment of that.
Thank you. Both really good stories. Circling back to that same question for you, and what do you feel has been APINK's biggest impact on the API trans, queer, and working class BIPOC community? Just a small question.
Yeah, I'm laughing because I'm like, wow, that is such a small question. Okay, I'm going to give you like an impact and a half. I think that APINK exists because we fill a necessary role within our movement ecosystem. Trans and queer people have existed in Asian and Pacific Islander communities for centuries. And we were often the first people to be targeted when colonizers arrived in our lands, because we were the people who were healers. We were the people who were historians and storytellers. We were the people who held our communities together. And those histories have been erased. And so I think the biggest role and impact APINK has played and will continue to, I hope, play is bridging the experiences of trans and queer API people, making space for us to learn our histories and build a future where we can continue to exist and thrive despite the best efforts of violent systems. And I think the half impact I wanted to share, or maybe the process part of that, is that we are really trying to contribute a way of organizing that is rooted in relationship building and trust and in values. Something that I think we know from experience is necessary for our liberation and is so hard to practice. And we are trying to bring that in through our leadership development, but also by, training and sharing practices with other folks in our movements. And yeah, that's what I think our biggest impact is.
Thank you. And staying with you, Ewan, how can folks who are listening to the show support your operation, your programs? Now that folks are coming back, can folks volunteer? How can folks get engaged?
This is a great question. If you are a trans or queer Asian and Pacific Islander person here in the Bay Area, get on that website. Go to apink.org/get involved and sign up to volunteer. We need you to join us in our work. If you want to learn more about our communities, you can visit a lot of our resources. You can check out dragonfruitproject.org to visit our online museum of trans and queer API movement histories. You can check out apink.org/up2us to learn about our community-led needs assessment of trans API people in the Bay, and so much more. And if you just want to support us by making sure that we can fundraise enough for all this work to actually happen, to resource it, you can visit apink.org/donate to donate and help sustain us. Those are all ways to get involved.
Thank you. And Lindley, same question. How can folks who want to support Blue Heart become members, funders? But then if I'm an artist, for example, or an organization like APINK and I want to apply to Blue Heart, what do I do?
I'll answer that second question first. So how we have accountability is that we ask all of our current partner organizations to nominate, recommend future ones. So this volunteer team at Blue Heart, which is a very awesome team, are not the ones making decisions. It's the activists and organizers who have the trusted credibility on the ground to be recommended in the past that recommend future ones. That's our model of accountability. And yes, you can definitely join as a member. We have members giving $2 a month. We have members giving $200 a month. So we have a whole range. You can join at any level and learn about and support kick-ass movement organizations building real political power. We also have, as I just mentioned, a really awesome volunteer team. I think we have about 12 folks right now. Some have been around for literally the entire 5 years that we've been in existence. Some are new, and it's just a really fun group of folks who are excited to throw down in a variety of ways. There are tasks, small and big, on a monthly basis to help our vision become a reality. So if you want to contribute in that way, you can absolutely reach out on our website. And then finally, I just want to lift up, we just released our annual grassroots giving guide, which I haven't seen any more like this out there. It is a giving guide of grassroots under-resourced organizations across the United States. And this year we have $30,000 in matching funds, which means if you give to any of the orgs on that list, I think there's about 96, they will be matched twofold until we reach 30K. So I want to get that out. It's been newly researched, revamped, redesigned, and so excited to see that out in the world.
So staying with the idea of the guide, could you share with the audience a little bit of what the criteria was to be one of the organizations on the guide itself?
Yeah, great question. So it's the same criteria in terms of who we support as Blue Heart. We basically just asked our movement partners who should be on this list. And then our only vetting criteria where we trust that those organizations that were recommended are those that are building real political power and doing grassroots organizing to do that. And then they're under-resourced, which basically means they don't have big PR budgets. They don't have fundraising budgets. They're often flying under the radar of philanthropy that's giving large grants. And so smaller gifts are going to be meaningful. And they don't, because of not having traditional fundraising capacity, really can benefit from increased visibility.
And again, to your point, this could be someone donating $10 or $10,000. Yuen, turning to you, could you please share with the audience one of your favorite stories of being engaged in an APINC?
Yeah, there are a lot of stories, a lot of memories of APINC that I've really loved and that have changed me. But my favorite is probably still my first experience with APINC. I showed up in the early summer at my first day of the summer organizer program, really not knowing what to expect and feeling really nervous that I wasn't going to be trans or queer, skillful or knowledgeable enough to be a part of this. And then people I didn't know, people I know now, but at the time were strangers to me, welcomed me in like I was an old friend. And as I was like, wow, do I know these people? Like, why are they being so kind to me? Thinking that to myself, Sammy, our co-director and our outgoing director, sat me down and was like, today you're not just going to be here, you're going to be a radical welcomer. And I was like, oh, what's radical welcome? And they taught me about how radical welcome is the practice of ensuring that we build spaces where all of our people never have to question whether they belong, which we are so often made to. And I just never imagined that could be a skill or a thing to practice. But when it was crystallized for me and I felt it in my body, what it was like to be welcomed in that way, when I had so many questions about whether I belonged, I think I will always remember that. And it definitely guides me today.
Thank you for that story. And Lindley, favorite story could be volunteers at Blue Heart, could be organization, could be an artist. You have so many stories to choose from. I know it's going to be hard.
This is a really hard, I think this is the hardest question. I think that my favorite thing about Blue Heart is that we have engendered trust across a lot of difference. The moment that's coming to mind is just when my co-founder and I transitioned Blue Heart from what we did most of the day to what we did over nights and weekends and transitioned it to be volunteer run. It was a huge leap of faith. We didn't know if that was the end. We didn't know what was going to happen next. And it was really amazing to have members come out of the woodwork to keep Blue Heart alive and not just have us bumble along. It was like folks that were so excited to completely level up our social media, so excited to bring new events and community gatherings into our ecosystem, people that wanted to facilitate art collaborations that we hadn't even dreamed of before. And so just seeing the power of vision and the power of common values bring people together and really bring commitment and skills and creativity to the project that we had been working with was such a beautiful moment and really showed the power of what collective visioning could create.
And Yuen, just circling back for a moment, one of the things I noticed in reading about APINC's work was the interdependence. Can you talk a little bit about that as far as the community?
Yeah, are you curious about why it's important to us or how it's practiced?
I would say how it's practiced.
Oh, yeah. Good question. There's a thing that I hear every year at APINC where people will join as volunteers or will come to our leadership exchange workshop series in the summer or the summer organizer program. And afterwards, they'll tell me Yuen, when I showed up, I thought I was going to learn how to phone bank or door knock or canvas. But instead, I just went through a 4-hour workshop on how to ask for help and why it's important. And the reason that we are always talking about interdependence and it's so important to us is because so many of us come from homes and backgrounds where asking for help was deeply frowned upon and where actually the marker of strength or success or worth was your ability to do things on your own. And I think that learning how to ask for help, learning how to move through conflict in a way that tends to a relationship and doesn't seek to destroy it, these are skills that are deeply healing for every single person in our community. But they also serve a bigger political purpose. In the world that we are working towards, we want to be skillful at tearing stuff down and breaking down systems that are violent and harmful for us. But if we are going to learn how to build something new, we have to learn how to govern and we have to learn how to work with each other. and how to ask each other for support and to give it. So we truly believe at APINC that a revolutionary world starts with our individual interactions. And that starts with asking for help, inviting people into supporting you.
Thank you. A wonderful description of how you're practicing it. All right. So final question for both of you. I'm going to start out with you, Yuen. So here we have 19 months of a global pandemic. We have a reckoning, if you will, with white supremacy with George Floyd. We have API members being attacked. We have an economic meltdown now coming back. Out of all of this proverbial carnage, if you will, what do you feel are some of the positive things that could come out of this pandemic to support APINC's work and the API community?
Yeah, thanks for asking. To be honest, it's really hard to say what's been positive that's come out of this because it has been such a painful and isolating time. But if I was to say anything, it would be that crises show us when things just aren't working. They make that really clear, the contradiction of where we need to be and where we are. And like Lindley mentioned earlier, if there is anything that I've seen transform in the past 19 months, it is that more and more people are unwilling to accept what we previously accepted as normal. People are unwilling to accept that so many people are incarcerated in conditions that are inhumane even when COVID is not a problem. They're unwilling to accept so many folks being moved from prisons to deportation pipelines and being stripped of their families and communities. And I hope that as organizers and cultural workers and artists, we can continue to make those contradictions in the ways that our systems are set up so clear that the alternatives, what we really need, continue to be irresistible for people, even beyond moments of crisis when that is more obvious than usual.
Thank you. And Lindley, same really easy to answer question.
Thanks, George. And thank you for that beautiful answer, Yuen. Similarly, what I've seen is that we saw that rules can be broken overnight. That initial scramble when COVID-19 hit really shook me in a deep way. Like it shook my deeply entrenched liberalism and a kind of small-mindedness around what's possible when I saw so many of the rules being tossed out the window. And echoing Yuen, there's no longer a tolerance for a recalcitrant incremental approach. We know that systems can change now if we want them to, and we are thirsty for it. The other thing I'll say is I just see so often a intimacy with our deep interconnection in a way that so many urban dwellers, white folks, so many folks that have been isolated from our inherent interdependence are now so awake to. And whether it's walking the streets or understanding where our food sources come from, or just more awareness of how dependent we are in our neighborhood, has really awakened questions and an eagerness to engage that is echoing across this work and all of our work in really beautiful ways.
Thank you. I want to thank Yuen Wang for sharing APINC programs and services, along with Lindley Meese for sharing Blue Heart's work today. We'll make sure that listeners have your contact information, the Blue Heart Giving Guide link, websites for both organizations, and all your social media so folks can follow both APINC and Blue Heart's work, get engaged, and to help out in your efforts in focusing in, of course, on the API, trans, queer, and working class BIPOC community members. So please stay safe and healthy as we work our way through this new pseudo-normalcy. That's it for this episode of Voices of the Community. You've been listening to the voices of co-founder and director of Blue Heart, Lindley Meese, along with the co-director of APINC, Yuen Wang. To become a member, volunteer, and fund Blue Heart's work, please go to blueheartaction.org. And to find out more and support APINC's work with our Asian American and Pacific Islander trans, queer, and working class, Black, Indigenous, and people of color community members, go to apienc.org. We hope that you enjoyed the insights, points of view, and personal stories from the voices of changemakers and their nonprofits and small businesses featured in this series. To find out more and get engaged with the nonprofits, small businesses, and staff members featured in the series, please go to my website, georgecoster.com, and click on Voices of the Community to find links to the extended versions of these interviews and to listen to the entire series. After listening to these stories, we hope that you will consider making a donation and volunteering to provide a hand up to your fellow community members. I want to thank my associate producer, Eric Estrada, and Casey Nance at Citron Studios, along with the wonderful crew at the San Francisco Public Press and KSFP. Voices of the Community is a member of Intersection for the Arts, which allows us to offer you a tax deduction for your contributions. Please go to georgecoster.com and click on the donate link to make a donation to help us provide future shows just like this one. While you're on our website, you can enjoy our archived past shows, which feature community voices working on solutions to critical issues facing Northern California communities. And you can sign up for our newsletter to find out more about future shows, as well as shows and events from the organizations that are included in our episodes. Take us along on your next COVID walk by subscribing to Voices of the Community on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Google Podcast, or wherever you get your podcast. You can follow us on Twitter at George Coster, and we'd love to hear from you with feedback and show ideas, so send us an email to george@georgecoster.com. I'm George Coster in San Francisco, and thank you for listening.